The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
And history, New Zealand's Laurel Hubbard, the first openly transgender female athlete to compete at the Olympics. Laurel Hubbard, prior to her transition, competed in men's weightlifting until 2001. Stopped lifting at the age of 23, took a 15-year break from the sport, transitioned in her mid-30s, and now at the age of 43, the oldest weightlifter in Tokyo and competing at the top international level now for 4 years, since 2017.
Tonight we are focusing on a member of the University of Pennsylvania women's swim team. She is shattering records, but she's also re-energizing the controversy over transgender athletes. Some say it's a question of fairness. Others say it should be about allowing athletes to be their true selves.
UPenn swimmer Leah Thomas has even more spectators keeping an eye on how she competes as a transgender athlete.
I think that it's amazing.
I don't think it's fair.
Thomas had great success in her most recent meets, shattering records at UPenn. There's buzz that she would become the NCAA's first Division I transgender national champion. About time, says ACLU Philadelphia's Naima Sanchez.
Trans rights are human rights.
Sanchez says it's about being seen
through my personal narrative as a trans person,
and athletes being allowed to compete in the gender with which they identify.
Having the liberty of acknowledging who you are and being proud of your gender identity.
Republican State Representative Barbara Gleim thinks the exact opposite. Before her transition, Thomas competed on the UPenn men's swim team.
The International Olympic Committee unveiled new guidelines on transgender athletes on November 16th. The new framework says that athletes should be allowed to compete in the category that best aligns with their self-determined gender identity. It replaces the criteria released by the IOC in 2015, which had a limit on trans woman athletes' testosterone levels.
There's been much conversation on this issue of transgender athletes in sport, as you've heard from those brief clips of some of the more recent stories. I've been wanting to do a podcast on this topic for some time, but wanted to wait until there was something worthy of talking about, and not just the topics from groups slinging arrows at each other across the social media platforms. Now, the IOC, as you've heard, has released its guidelines on transgender athletes to the public. So now I thought it would be a good idea to talk about the implications. And I wanted to have a conversation with someone credible, someone who knows the history and science, and perhaps someone who could even speak from experience and provide a balanced perspective. And my guest on this podcast certainly did not disappoint. She is Joanna Harper, and she is the author of the book Sporting Gender: The History, Science, and Stories of Transgender and Intersex Athletes. I highly recommend the book. I will put the link to the book in the show notes. It's very good. She is a medical physicist by profession, holding a master's degree in medical physics. And she is herself a transgender athlete and an avid endurance enthusiast and a distance runner by choice. And she's the only person in history to publish a peer-reviewed article on the performance of transgender athletes. She's also the only transgender person ever to be an advisor to the International Olympic Committee on matters of gender and sport. and she's also currently a PhD candidate at Loughborough University. So we touch on her personal story of transitioning and what drove her passion to dive into the science and ultimately be an advisor to the IOC on the topic. We have an exchange about the problem statement at hand and try to break it down for the listener and talk about some of the high-level statistics. We have an exchange about fairness and how fairness has historically been defined, and she offers her opinion on how she believes it should be defined. We touch on some of the high-profile former female athletes that have spoken out and her interactions with them and discussions she's had with some of them, and whether she thinks some of them have evolved in their beliefs and perspectives. And finally, we walk through the new guidelines released by the IOC, and she gives her opinion about what she agrees with and what she disagrees with, and we discuss the implications for the sport governing bodies going forward. I think you'll enjoy the conversation. Now, while some might expect her to throw meat to the lions, she doesn't do that. I think you'll see that she instead chooses to be a very balanced, honest, and evaluative thinker, and she genuinely gives a science and evidence-based opinion. So as you listen to the conversation, I'd especially invite those who feel that they have this issue 100% figured out because of the talking points fed by the respective echo chambers. Come to the table with your swords and shields down. You just may come away with a broader perspective on this topic. More to say in my afterword. Right now, without further delay, I give you Joanna Harper. All right, I am on with Joanna Harper. Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
You're welcome, Tony.
All right. So I've been wanting to have a podcast on this topic. It's been on my radar screen, but I just didn't want to have a topic on it until I knew that there was something relevant that I could actually talk about. And now that the IOC framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sex variations is out. It's a 6-page document. I read the entire thing. And so now we have something substantive that we can actually talk about. And you are uniquely qualified here. So you're many things. You're a researcher. You are a master's recipient in, was it kinesiology?
No, my master's degree was in medical physics.
Medical physics, right? Okay, and you're also a researcher that's done 10 or more publications, cited many times on this topic, and you're also a trans athlete. So needless to say, you're uniquely qualified to talk about this topic. So for the listeners who may not know you personally, and feel free to provide as much or as little information as you'd like. I want to know, would you be interested in talking to our listeners about you, who you are, your life experience that brought you to where we are today, and perhaps what has driven this passion of yours to the cause of inclusion in sport.
Yeah. So, I've always been a scientist. I've always been an athlete, and I've always been transgender, even though I spent much of my life denying that fact. But it wasn't until my gender transition began in 2004 that all three of these important aspects of my life began to mesh together.
Right.
In August of 2004, I started taking hormone therapy, and I knew that with the reduction in testosterone that I would start running slower. But I thought it'd be a gradual process and that I wouldn't get that much slower. But I was surprised to find two things happen. One is that the changes occurred pretty quickly. Within weeks, I was running markedly slower.
Mhm.
And then after 9 months of hormone therapy, I was running 12% slower. And that's the difference between serious male distance runners and serious female distance runners. So 9 months of hormone therapy was enough to eliminate my male advantage in distance running. And
Mhm.
so as a scientist, I was intrigued. And I thought I would find out why. So I started to learn about the endocrinology and the exercise physiology involved, just reading. But I also found other trans women who had undergone the same sort of process, trans women distance runners who'd gotten markedly slower.
Mhm.
And it took me a while. It took me 7 years to gather data, but eventually I gathered enough data to write a paper. And it was the first analysis of the performance of transgender athletes, and it was published in 2015. And at the time, I was working in healthcare in the US. And, I didn't really think anything more beyond the fact that I could get data and that it was valuable data and it should be published. And
Right.
so I did. The paper came out, and then my whole life changed. And I didn't expect that this would happen, but international sporting federations started talking to me because they were interested. The media found out about me. And in 2018, Loughborough University contacted me. Loughborough University is in England, and they are fairly consistently rated the #1 sports science university in the world. They said that they were looking to start up a program to study trans athletes, and they wondered if I could help them start up their program. And I told them, well, I'm not qualified. I don't have a PhD. And they said, oh, well, why don't you just come over here, study trans athletes, and get one?
Perfect.
And so I did. So that's my life story in a nutshell.
Wow. And hearing you speak, I like hearing you speak because you speak in a scientific way. You're balanced on your assessment and your judgments on the matter, and because you've actually lived it, you can speak with firsthand knowledge. But I do appreciate the way that you speak in such a balanced way and scientific way about the matter. This issue has been so polarized, and you can always tell immediately whether or not someone is really genuinely caring about the question, or whether someone is just taking sound bites and things that are cooked up in echo chambers, and they jump on the issue on both sides, on both sides of the issue. So I appreciate that every time I hear you speak, that you're making a concerted decision to speak about it in a very balanced and a scientific way.
Well, thank you, Tony.
Yeah. And so you transitioned in 2004. do you care to offer what it was like prior to 2004? That feeling. Sometimes I've heard that described. That feeling that you felt like some people say that, oh, you feel like you're in a different person's body. Did you feel that, or is it really that?
Certainly I wasn't happy having, among other things, male genitalia. I certainly wanted my body to be more feminine than it was. I have always seen myself as a woman, and so to to go through male puberty was the worst time of my life, without any doubt. And if I could have somehow prevented that, I certainly would have. At the time, the idea of starting somebody on hormone therapy before puberty was certainly something that wasn't done. And then, when I was growing up, if you were transgender, you just weren't going to be accepted in society, and so. I just was very, very unhappy with with who I was and my life in general. It was so inauthentic.
Yeah.
I mean, so all of those things really bothered me.
Yeah, I see. And I think I've heard those stories, and those stories are very compelling. You can go online and see many people with their own personal testimonies about how that feels. And unless you've had that feeling, there's no way that you can really speak upon it. But I think, thank you for talking about that. So let's just for the layperson. I mean, this issue has been out in the public sphere for some time, and almost everyone has heard something related to it. But let's pretend that someone was living in a cave and has heard nothing about the issue of what's laying before governing bodies of sport to try to solve. So if you can, for the layperson, how would you summarize this challenge before the governing bodies of sport with regards to trans women being able to compete in sport?
In women's sport in particular.
Sport. Women's sport, correct, yes.
So there are very good reasons why we have men's sport and women's sport. Mm-hmm. When men go through puberty, they get a huge increase in testosterone levels, and this causes a number of changes: larger heart, greater lung capacity, increased muscle size, speed, strength, stamina, you name it. These are all in red blood cells. Yep. So prior to puberty, the differences between prepubescent male athletes and prepubescent female athletes are fairly small, but it doesn't take long once boys go on puberty and become men for the differences to get very large. And so once males have gone through puberty, then the idea that at high levels of sport that we can have women competing equitably with men, it just doesn't hold true in almost any sport. And so if we want to have women winning Olympic gold medals, earning professional sports contracts, etc., then we need a separate women's category where we don't allow men to compete. But it's not always clear who is or isn't male and female. In somewhere roughly 98, 99% of humanity. People are very sexually dimorphic, but it's that last 1.5 or 2% of humanity that gets troublesome, and that section of humanity includes both intersex people and transgender people. Let's just, for the sake of this, let's just focus on transgender people. But in particular, trans women who've gone through a male-type puberty will potentially gain all of the advantages that men would get in sports, even though trans women don't want to undergo male puberty. They still have, and they still get those advantages.
Yeah.
So, however, those advantages are mitigated by the hormone therapy that trans women go through. The testosterone is brought back down to female levels, and that makes a number of changes. However, it doesn't change everything. It doesn't undo all of the changes that occurred during male puberty.
Right.
And so the question is, should we allow trans women to compete in the women's category? And if so, then under what conditions?
Right. And so some of the things that you mentioned, and I remember that time going through puberty, man, it was like turning into a superhero. I remember I was just sort of a very small, scrawny kid, and I used to get pushed around a little bit by the bigger kids. And then in the period of maybe 18 months, 2 years, after getting bathed with that testosterone, it was like turning into a superhero. I was destroying kids. I mean, it is like turning into a superhero. It's like, for me, it happened relatively quickly, and it happened over a span of maybe 18 months and 2 years that I just came back and I saw a noticeable difference in my just performance, strength, speed. But you mentioned a couple of things like larger hearts, larger lungs, larger pulmonary airways, size of skeleton, strength of skeleton. Those are things right there that, like you said, are really significant and are you can't mute those. So the question now is, does hormone replacement therapy diminish enough advantage where the net, perhaps maybe the net change, the net difference eliminates any advantage that may have existed pre-transition? Am I capturing that right?
Yeah, more or less, but the certainly and in most sports, it's not going to be true that hormone therapy will mean that there's no advantage remaining, and certainly it's also true that trans women will have some disadvantages as well. Their larger frames are now being powered by reduced muscle mass and reduced aerobic capacity, and that could lead to disadvantages in things like recovery and quickness and so on. But if we're looking at net, if we take all the advantages and all the disadvantages that trans women have against cis women, and do a sport by sport comparison, it is probably true, it's undoubtedly true, that in most sports, hormone therapy will not eliminate the advantages that trans women have. But I would think that in most sports, hormone therapy will mitigate the advantages to the point where it is reasonable to allow trans women and cis women to compete against one another. However, the amount of data that we have at this point is minuscule. And while I say I think that is true, it's certainly not provable at this point. And there will be years and perhaps decades of research necessary before we can say anything definitive.
Yeah. And so just a quick follow-up on that. So we define fairness in sport in really just about a handful of ways from what I can see. So we male female dimorphic effects are certainly the basis behind what historically has been called sex separated sports, right? And so then there's impairment, right? A wheelchair marathoner or para athletes, and then there's weight, right? Boxer, heavyweight boxer, lightweight boxer, middleweight boxer, and that's just about it. I think
Age,
right? Age is another one that you don't see it a lot in elite sports, but in other age group sports, it absolutely age categories is another one for sure. So yeah, so when people say, "Oh well, let's have categories for things like tallness and height and things like that," I think the way that we've historically classified or defined fairness is by the fewest categories as we can, and let sport self-select out things like how long someone's arms are, or how tall they are, or VO2 max or lactate threshold and things like that. Do you think we can define fairness any better than the way that we have?
Not necessarily, but
Yeah.
the one thing that, when it comes to this topic of gender variant athletes, I would prefer not to use the word fairness, because one could also say that fairness means considering the needs of repressed minorities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that could be a way to define fairness as well. And so I would like to focus on what I would call equitable or meaningful competition. And meaningful competition is competition where, advantages may exist, but the outcome is not certain before the competition starts. And let me give you a wonderful example of that, and that's the game of baseball. The way the diamond is situated lends many advantages to left-handed baseball players.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's well acknowledged that left-handers have substantial advantages in the sport, especially at the pitcher and batter positions, which is largely at the heart of the sport. Yet we don't have a left-handed league and a right-handed league. We acknowledge that right-handers are somewhat disadvantaged, but many terrific baseball players have been right-handed, and many of the greats. So that is a sport where we acknowledge there are advantages, but we have meaningful competition. In fact, many people think that the mix of left-handers and right-handers in the sport is one of the things that makes the sport special.
Right.
And then the sort of the defining characteristic where we can't have meaningful sport based on biological differences, and you've already mentioned it. A heavyweight boxer and a lightweight or a flyweight boxer, there's no meaningful competition. The big boxer wins every time, and so the question, isn't really, do trans women have advantages? Because yes, of course, trans women have advantages, but can we have meaningful sport between trans women and cis women? I would prefer to frame it like that than talk about fairness.
Yeah. And that's a great example that you gave with the left-handed pitchers. Same thing with southpaw in boxing, what they call a southpaw or a left-handed fighter. It's sport is the end product of the characteristics we want to see in people who have skills. I mean, we celebrate this, and of course, there is a an inclusivity part of this, right? It would be a shame if someone wanted to play in a sport and they were deemed ineligible, and then we just told them, sorry, go play, chess or pool. that would be very difficult to do, all right, to someone. I think, Nelson Mandela, one of my favorite quotes is by Nelson Mandela, the famous quote where he said, sport has the power to change the world. And he used sport to unite South Africa. And I think he's right. Sport has that power to unite us like no one else does. And to tell someone that they just can't simply play because there's no space for them, that's really heartbreaking. So we have to find out how to solve this. And I'm just glad I'm not one of the people that have to, because this is a really hard problem.
It is, and it's a problem that sports have been grappling with for many years, especially when it comes to intersex athletes. It's not as long a period that sports have been dealing with transgender athletes, but the IOC first came out with a transgender policy in 2004, and even before that, some sports were looking at ways to include trans athletes in with cisgender athletes. So, it's probably about 20 years, and it's at least as controversial now as it was 20 years ago. And I don't see the controversy going away anytime in my life.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be the biggest issue in sport, in my opinion, over the next few years. And it's two things are happening. There's either a lot of talk of polarized people going back and forth, or there's other people that are absolutely scared to death to even talk about this. I booked a podcast, I won't say the person's name, with a doctor to talk about menstruation and the menstruation question as to whether or not coaches should coach female-born athletes differently based upon menstruation. There was a sports psychologist by the name of Stacey Sims. I don't know, probably heard of Stacey Sims. She wrote a book about called Roar, which basically the whole premise is, listen, coaches, you should be evaluating your female athletes differently, because and menstruation is something you should be talking about, and because it affects the training cycle, and it affects maybe even there's some nutrition aspects to that. So I brought a doctor on to talk about that prospect, and she agreed, but then backed out because she just didn't want to. She thought that this was too close to what she probably believed to be a third rail conversation. So there's either a lot of conversation, or there's people scared to death to talk. Before we go on to the IOC guidelines and get your thoughts on those, what do you make of some of the bigger high profile athletes that have spoken out? So Martina Navratilova was one of the biggest. Paula Radcliffe also has spoken out. And they've sort of been speaking out on the side of keeping the women's category protected. What are your thoughts on them, or have you spoken with any of them?
I have spoken with both Paula and Martina, and I'm happy to say that if you talk to Martina in particular, her views are significantly different than they were 2 or 3 years ago.
Really?
And in fact, early in 2019, Martina said that trans women were cheating if they competed in women's sports, and that caused quite a furor.
They went after her, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people went after her, and partly because she's been an LGBT icon for years in sports. She was, one of the first female athletes to come out as gay, and so, it was a blow to many in the community, and so she took a lot of abuse. One of the things that Martina did was she actually went to Loughborough University. She talked to those of us there. The BBC filmed a special around that. And I actually had the chance to talk to Martina for about 3 hours. Now, Martina didn't change her viewpoint overnight, and she didn't change her viewpoint just because she talked to me. But if you talk to Martina in 2021, Martina will say that again, women's sports is very dear to her, but that she thinks that after trans women mitigate their advantages with hormone therapy, it is reasonable to have some avenue to allow trans women to compete with cisgender women. Mm-hmm. And so, I've been thrilled that Martina has made this shift, and I'll take like a little bit of responsibility for that, or a little bit of the glory, if you will, for changing Martina's mind. But there were a lot of factors involved. But I'm happy to say that Martina has changed her mind. Now, Paula Radcliffe has also changed her mind. But Paula went again early on. She was, saying that she thought transgender women would ruin women's sports. Paula sat in on a conference sponsored by World Athletics in the fall of 2019. Again, I was in the room, but there were 20 or 25 of us in the room, and we were having a very candid back and forth conversation. And at one point in the afternoon, Paula said, I don't think that all trans women should be banned from women's sports. And so, so by the end of that day, she had changed her opinion. Now, Paula hasn't really spoken very publicly about it since then, but she is no longer saying the things publicly that she said before, and she has privately changed her opinion. So those are examples of well-known sports stars who have changed their opinion. Now, there are some. Sharon Davies, for instance.
Oh, Sharon, the swimmer.
Yeah, is still adamant that trans women shouldn't be in sports. But the two that you mentioned right off the top of the bat have changed their mind, partly because they were willing to keep an open mind, and they listened to what a number of people, myself included, had to say.
You're right. I think this takes a nuanced opinion. This takes level heads. And the rigid dogma and groupthink, I think, has to take a back seat, right? If we're ever going to come to a solution on how to do this, because it would be very sad to just tell some people that they just simply couldn't play sport. That would be horrible. So we have to find a solution. I'm not saying that I know what the solution is. I mean, some people have pulled out the idea of a third category. Do you support the third category option?
It's not a very practical option. I mentioned the numbers. Most people are sexually dimorphic. The transgender population makes up probably about 1% of humanity. And so if you're going to have a third category, you would have one category with 49.5% of humanity, another category with 49.5% of humanity, and a third category with 1% of humanity. Trying to get team sports, trying to get a transgender team sport to represent the United States, say in say soccer.
Yeah.
would be, and then even if you do, who do you play against? And then there's the question, when you talk about a third category, well, that would mean that trans women and trans men would both be in that category. Well, wouldn't you actually need 4 categories?
Yeah.
And then the 2 other categories would be even half the size that they were. So I just don't think it's practical.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the team sport, that seems impossible. I don't know how that would work. But if you had a third category where it was just open, where you had women, men, an open category, perhaps, trans men could compete in the men's category if they so choose. But you're right. I don't know how many competitors there would be, right? And so I had a podcast with a woman, Catherine Switzer, who was the first woman to officially run the Boston Marathon. And I remember they didn't have a women's category for the Boston Marathon, but women weren't allowed to run because they thought they thought your uterus would collapse, or they thought women weren't strong enough or something. But she kicked that door in 1967. And then it wasn't until, from several years after that, it was just her and maybe 3 or 4 others. And so for a long time, there just weren't many participants until maybe the mid 70s, where there was 40, and then it was 50, and then it was 1,000. And then obviously it wasn't until the 80s when Joan Benoit was the first Olympic women's marathon champion. So maybe, I don't know. My thought is if there was a third category, it would sometimes things seem like they're small in the beginning, and then they maybe it takes off as more people realize that category is available for them, and they realize that it's an option. Over the coming decades, maybe it flourishes. I don't know. So we covered a lot there. So the guidelines came out in October, November. So
and it should be noted that this is the 3rd iteration of the IOC guidelines. The IOC published guidelines in 2004 that required trans women to have surgery, 2 years of post-surgical hormones, and all legal changes.
Right.
And then in 2016, the IOC published a 2nd iteration that was a testosterone-based policy saying that trans women had to lower their testosterone to make it under a specific level for 12 months. So those were 2 previous iterations. And then, as you say, the 3rd iteration of the IOC guidelines came out in October of this year.
Right. Okay. And thank you for that. And then as I was reading it, it would be the first page and a couple pages are sort of introductory. The 3rd page talks about, non-discrimination, prevention of harm. They do cover a sort of definition of fairness, but there's 2 that I want to get your opinion on. 5 says no presumption of advantage. And then 6 talks about the evidence that should be demanded. And so first, what's your general opinion of the entire thing? And then we can dive into some more of the specific parts. Do you think that this was robust enough coming from the IOC, from someone who's actually been an advisor to the IOC?
So let me tell you that in June of 2019, the IOC brought in a group of scientific advisors, and they had done this on an irregular basis since approximately 1990. I was asked to join this group in 2015, and they brought a group of us in, and their basic message that day was that they were going to prioritize human rights over science. And that led to the process of this set of guidelines coming out. And so it's very clear that they have made inclusion a priority. They have made a very concerted effort to champion two marginalized groups, transgender people and intersex people. And certainly, I think it's an important step that an organization as powerful and as public as the IOC has made this commitment to inclusion, and I certainly think that that's a positive thing. However, I do take issue with some of the details of the guidelines, and you mentioned two of them in particular. And if you'd like, we can talk about more details about the Section 5 and Section 6.
So let's read for the listeners, just so you have it. It says Section 5.1, no athlete should be precluded from competing or excluded from competition on the exclusive ground of an unverified, alleged, or perceived unfair competitive advantage due to their sex variations, physical appearance, or transgender status. So now I think I've heard you said that you believe that there is pre-transition, there's an advantage, and post-transition there may be some advantage. Does the advantage balance out with the disadvantages? So what that 5.1, what would you say about that?
So, they're saying presumed advantages. Well, it's not a presumption to say that trans women have advantages. Trans women, even after hormone therapy, will on average be taller, bigger, and stronger than cisgender or typical women. And it's not a presumption, it's a fact. And those are advantages in many sports. And so, to suggest that that there's, this idea of advantages is some sort of unsupported presumption is simply not true. But as I said, it's certainly more complicated than just talking about advantage. The real question is, can we have meaningful competition? And as I have said before, I think that in most sports, after trans women have been on hormone therapy, the answer to that is yes. However, this Section 5, says that there should be no presumption of advantage, and it's just simply not true to suggest that there's no advantage. There's, you have two different population groups. Of course, there's advantages.
Right. Yeah, and I was very surprised at that, right? Because the IOC has generally been extremely scientific. I mean, the amount of doctors, PhDs, I mean, they have more doctors and PhDs than anybody. So I'm very surprised that 5.1 passed that consortium of scientists and doctors.
Well, it didn't, in fact, because they cut us all out. So they, as I said, they had brought in experts over the years to advise them on these, and they took our advice up until this one, and then they, as I said, in this June meeting, they essentially said, your services are no longer required. We are now going to focus on human rights. And so instead of listening to the scientists, they listened to human rights specialists, some of whom have PhDs and are doctors in a sense, but they were listening to a substantially different group of people than they had listened to before.
I see. Interesting. Okay, so this 5.2, until evidence determines otherwise, athletes should not be deemed to have an unfair or disproportionate competitive advantage due to their sex variations, physical appearance, and or transgender status. Now, that just said to me, if I'm interpreting this right, you need to look at robust research before making a decision. Is that fair to say? But this,
well, again, this is just, Section 5 is just talking about advantage.
Yeah.
And the suggestion, that the fact that trans women have advantages over cis women, it is a fact. The idea that they're claiming it's a presumption that's not supported, it just doesn't hold water.
Yeah, it doesn't hold. Yeah. And this terminology, disproportionate competitive advantage, that seems peculiar because in sport, the difference between first and second and third is generally less than 1% performance. So even if an advantage is small, that's enough to affect an outcome in the top of sport, right?
It is enough to affect an outcome, yes. But given that we only have two categories, then it's certainly true that the size of the advantage does matter.
Yeah.
But again, that's not what Section 5 is saying. That Section 5 is suggesting that that this idea of competitive advantage is a presumption and not supported by fact, and that just isn't true.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, and then the evidence-based approach in Section 6 just essentially summarizes any restrictions arising from eligibility criteria should be based on robust and peer-reviewed research, demonstrates a consistent, unfair, disproportionate competitive advantage, largely based on data collected from demographic groups, demonstrates that such disproportionate and competitive advantage and or unpreventable risk exists. Maybe talking about
contact sports, for instance.
Sports, right?
Yeah.
Contact sports and combat sports, MMA, boxing, things like that. And then it says, should the eligibility criteria prevent an athlete from entering a given competition, such athletes should be allowed to participate in other disciplines. So that means if you're ineligible in track and field, you should be able to play or compete in equestrian. Is what does it say?
It's not entirely clear what they mean by that, but they are suggesting to provide some sort of avenue to allow people to play, and I think that was large. That part of it is largely a reaction to World Rugby banning trans women from the women's category. But let me get back to what I think is the heart of this section, and that they are saying that there should be no restrictions placed on transgender or intersex athletes until there is robust peer-reviewed research. And robust peer-reviewed research means research from more than one center by more than one author, where you get a collection of research that you can make informed decisions based on not just one author or one university.
Right.
And right now, There's only one paper. My 2015 paper is still the only paper out there that is focused entirely on trans athletes. Now, there are our group at Loughborough, there are other groups that are starting to investigate this, and there will be data that will be published. But it's going to be a slow process. It's going to be years, perhaps decades, till we have robust peer-reviewed research on trans athletes. And yet, sports federations need to make decisions now. And so they have to do the best they can with the data that are available now. And I would certainly suggest that any policies made by sporting federations now should be considered living documents. And the sports federations should say, this is the best we can do with the information we have. The information is limited. When we get more and better data, we will be able to make better policy. Yeah. But part of those decisions that the sports federations would make would include some restrictions on trans women or intersex women in on a sport by sport basis. Is a very reasonable thing. And I think it's important to acknowledge sort of the sport by sport basis. For instance, trans women are taller than cis women. I mean, it's a fact. It's just that is undisputable. But in basketball, being taller is an advantage. In gymnastics, being taller is a disadvantage.
That's right. Yeah.
So you certainly wouldn't want the same regulations for basketball and gymnastics, because if you're looking at the height difference, well, it means it's something entirely different in those two sports.
Yeah, and I think that it's ultimately one of the best things that they did is and you can correct me if I'm wrong, they sort of kicked this back to individual sport governing bodies for them to come up with their own rules. Because like you said, it has to be sport specific. Archery, swimming, equestrian, there's so many different sports. Where's World Athletics going to fall on this? I mean, because usually World Athletics and IOC are usually in lockstep with each other.
Traditionally, they have been. World Athletics in 2019 came out with a transgender policy stating that trans women have to maintain testosterone below a specific level, have to have that maintained for 12 months before starting competition in the women's category, and thereafter maintain this low testosterone level. And World Athletics has said they're not changing their policy based on the IOC guidelines. So there is a significant difference between the two organizations. And then, as I mentioned, there's the third option, the World Rugby option, which just bans trans women outright. And so it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the next years. Will they adopt new policies based on the current IOC guidelines? Will they follow World Athletics? And several sports have said, yes, we are going to follow the lead of World Athletics rather than the IOC. Or will they follow the lead of World Rugby and ban trans women? And so there's these three options that are out there by these three prominent sports federations, and they're drastically different frameworks. And it remains to be seen how the world sporting federations will go in the future.
Well, Joanna, I think you better clear your calendar for the next 5 years, and maybe add a speaking fee. You'll have a new home, 2 new homes. So you had mentioned this. So there were some papers that were released just in the last couple of years. Karolinska Institute and some others. So what do you think about these papers? Because I think you had mentioned, you said, your papers there. Are these papers
So all of the papers by the Karolinska Institute, and then there was a review published, 2 reviews published, one by our group in Loughborough, one by 2 scientists, one in England, one from the Karolinska, that were looking at data from non-athletic trans people. And it's very important to understand that. And certainly, if we're talking about cisgender or typical people, you would never, ever, ever look at data from a study of non-athletes and say that it had anything to do with athletes. However, given the paucity of data on trans athletes, there is some utility in looking to see what happens with hormone therapy changes in non-athletes. However, the utility is very, very limited.
Yeah. So you're saying you cannot extrapolate out from those non-athletes, athletes, the effect that it would have on athletes. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. And it'll be a long time before you have representative peer groups that you can actually study that have good sample sizes, right? Because you need robust sample sizes of trans athletes.
The only way to get robust sample sizes is to do multi-centric, multinational studies. And so that the first step is to get people interested in doing this work, and then we have to collaborate. So yes, in order to get numbers, we have to do future multi-centric trials.
Wow. Yeah, this is going to be a challenge for the scientific method for sure. Okay, so let's. You've been very generous with your time. What would you say as a final word on this issue, especially with all of the back and forth and the polarized nature of the discourse on this topic? What are some final words that you would say to people?
I would say don't pay too much attention to what you see on Twitter, and you know, as you say, there are 2 groups that are shouting at each other over a chasm, and I would suggest, rather than paying too much attention to the voices from either of these groups, try to seek out rational, reasonable discourse that seeks some sort of middle ground, some sort of compromise position. And that would be what I would advocate for.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Joanna Harper, for giving us your time.
Oh, and can I say one other thing?
Yes, absolutely.
And then I went almost an hour without saying it. If people want more information on the topic, I have a book out. It's called Sporting Gender. It was published a year and a half ago. And if people want more information on the topic, yeah, really.
I want to get it. It's Sport and Gender.
Sporting Gender. Yep.
On Amazon?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to put the link to this into the show notes. There it is.
Yep.
I see it. I'm going to put the link to this in the show notes. So
I don't do a good enough job of plugging my book.
It's recent too. Recent information. Yep. Excellent. All right. Thank you, Joanna Harper, for coming on.
All right. Thanks, Tony. Bye-bye.
Thanks again to my guest, Joanna Harper. That was a great conversation. And whichever side you might be on with respect to this issue, I hope you learned something new from this podcast. And if nothing else, that 2 minds can come together, have a conversation about it, have a scientific view, but also be sympathetic and empathetic to the concept of equity and inclusion. You may have noticed that I stood clear of any conversations about specific athletes. That was by design. There's a lot of conversation right now in the public sphere about Leah Thomas, the UPenn transgender swimmer. And there's been conversation about Lauren Hubbard. I had those two clips in the beginning. But again, that was by design. I think the athletes are just following the rules. The rules are the rules right now. I mean, you're welcome to have issues with the rules, but right now, those athletes are just following the rules. So I think it's the rules, and that's why I really wanted to have a conversation with Joanna about the IOC guidelines, which are new. Those really set the stage for any updates or changes to policy from sport governing bodies. I agree with Joanna Harper that this will be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, issue in sports over the next few years. And that's just given the IOC's guidelines, World Athletics guidelines remaining in place. I suspect we might see varying rules emerge from the sports governing bodies. And then, of course, in the United States, I know there's people listening to this from all regions of the world, but in the United States, we have the NCAA, which is college, and then we have non-college sports, high school and junior high school sports. And these rules are really, in the United States, they're state-by-state rules. They're all over the place depending upon which state you may be in. And so other regions of the world will have to figure this out as well. So in the United States, there's even pending legislation on the matter in various states, and I wouldn't be surprised if there would be a Supreme Court case sometime in the future. You never know. So with the sports governing bodies, there's much to consider with this issue. There's safety as it relates to high contact and combat sports, right? Mixed martial arts, rugby, right? And then they have to consider inclusion, right? Inclusion is a big part of this. And then there is the concept of fairness and how fairness is defined, as we discussed on the podcast. Among my conversations with colleagues that are trans and friends that are trans, I realized there's a pretty broad range of opinion on this topic. It was more broad than I thought. And I've often wondered if we could do a poll. How would the poll results look? For instance, a poll among female-born athletes, a poll among trans athletes, a poll among coaches, for instance. And it would almost certainly need to be anonymous because, as we talked about in the podcast, there are many people that are still very uncomfortable with even talking about this topic. They see it as a sort of third rail conversation. From where I can see, there seems to be three broad positions out there, and there actually may be more than three, but the ones that are more prominent seem to be in three groups. Number one is, look, there's no differences between males and females. Therefore, there's no advantage. There's nothing to see here. That's a small group, fringe group. The second group, however, though, is a group that's essentially saying, look, of course there are advantages, but those advantages are eliminated with hormone replacement therapy. And anyone making the claim that the advantage still persists bears the burden to prove it. And the third group is who I define as those looking to keep the women's classification of sport tightly controlled, tightly protected, and shift the burden of proof to trans athletes or anyone advocating on behalf of trans athletes to prove that advantages conferred through puberty are gone and completely mitigated. So these are the groups that are emerging. I think as a coach, someone who trains and coaches athletes for competition against other athletes, I just sit back and watch this and to see what happens. See if we can come up with a solution that can get closer to that metaphorical efficient frontier that considers and manages fairness, safety, as well as inclusion. I hope to have another podcast on this sometime in the future, but again, I want to have one when there is something material to discuss. And so I'd like to hear your comments about this podcast. You can send them to contact@eventhorizon.tv. Thanks again for listening.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.